During the first week of Operation Killer, constant rains and the annual spring thaws produced quagmire conditions which do more to impede advancing UN columns than spotty red resistance. 1st Cavalry Division elements grind slowly northward in the central sector above Wonju on the heels of communist rear guard units. The purpose of Operation Killer is identical with that of the UN's limited offensive of the preceding month. General Ridgway again emphasizes that enemy casualties are his main objective. C-119s of the Combat Cargo Command deliver artillery ammo to the 1st Cavalry in the Central Mountain Sector, where the only troublesome red resistance is encountered. The load is ejected in a compact cluster, resulting in minimum spread on the drop zone. With road traffic mired, airlift operations again pay off to the advantage of our forces. Nose fuses are screwed into place at an artillery forward position in the Korean hills. Powder increments are unpacked, ready for immediate use. The chain of supply ends as armored artillery batteries fire outgoing rounds at enemy-held points in the wooded hills. Here, white phosphorus shells pound communist positions. Air bursts hurl metal fragments into the enemy emplacements. Since the Korean War began, the UN forces' close and plentiful artillery support has helped greatly to neutralize the large numerical superiority of the Reds. And here, artillery again softens communist defenses, clearing the way for the renewed Allied offensive.
The tide of battle ebbs and flows in Korea. Allied troops launch a new drive on the southern capital of Seoul. The United Nations is again on the offensive. Superior firepower drives North Koreans and Red Chinese into retreat as UN forces, after recapturing Suwon 15 miles below Seoul, maintain a slow but steady advance. Some patrols covered by tanks even advance to within 6 miles of the capital. Bitter cold and epidemics take their toll of the enemy as the dogged battle for strategic hills continues. There have been months of this relentless struggle, but the 35th Regiment is still in there pitching, only taking time out for chow and 40 winks.
The United Nations forces grind steadily forward toward Seoul. Described by field commanders as a limited offensive, the Allies near the outskirts of the much fought-over capital of southern Korea. Under cover of powerful tank support, the advance takes a fearful toll of North Koreans and Chinese Reds. Top UN commanders confer. Pacing the assault are F-80 and 86 jet planes. Maintaining constant pressure on enemy supply lines, the jets thunder down, spreading terror and havoc amongst the Reds. It has been estimated that they have accounted for almost 50,000 communist casualties. Department of Defense cameramen in a follow-up plane graphically record the impact of rockets on supply convoys. But the weapon that strikes terror into enemy hearts are the napalm bombs, which sear everything in their path. The jellied gasoline skipping along the ground turns the landscape into a holocaust. The railroad station that recently recaptured Suwon and a ghastly array of dead attests to Allied air power. Vastly outnumbered, United Nations forces ruling the skies continue to number their dead foes by the thousands. United Nations tanks and artillery, which have repeatedly stopped the tidal wave of Red Chinese and North Koreans, are massed again during the drive on Seoul. The big guns let go on commie positions. A small town is virtually pulverized after the bombardment as Allied soldiers follow up the barrage. Slowly but relentlessly over mined roads, the march on Seoul continues. Detectives scan every foot of the highway, and in many instances they hit pay dirt. Digging mines is a tough and dangerous job, but a necessary one. This tank would have been blown to bits had the mine at this spot not been removed. Awful havoc has been wrought by the Allied artillery and air bombardment. Here are graphic pictures which show how Red supply lines are being hammered to pieces. It is a part of the battle of attrition that has seen the enemy sustain casualties as high as 10,000 in a single day in their attempt to split UN lines down the center of the peninsula. Caught in the squeeze of a seesaw struggle are the tragic civilian victims. Shells and bombs are no respecter of persons. It'll be long before the ghastly total of civilian casualties is known, but the drive on Seoul goes on relentlessly.
United Nations air power continues its around-the-clock pounding of men and materiel. Merciless attrition and interdiction sorties prevent the communists from consolidating in any large buildup of forces. During the period 5 to 12 March, the United Nations attrition offensive moves steadily ahead in the Yangpyeong area north of the Han River. Across muddy and snow-streaked fields, troops of the 24th Division carry the battle to the enemy, with a heavy strike at strong communist forces entrenched on the western foothills of Korea's Central Mountains. Heavy armor of the United Nations moves up in close support of the 24th Division Riflemen. The 8th Army's numerically superior armor enables them to supply Allied foot soldiers with maximum support. These tanks, playing on the superstitious nature of the enemy, are painted with the markings of the tiger. Intensified armor-supported attacks of this kind are rolling back the Red aggressors along most of the front and are preventing them from initiating any offensive action of their own. Assault troops advance to the objective through dense underbrush, where the Reds still hold out despite the heavy artillery pounding. The attack moves to the crest of the hill, and grenades are used to blast the remaining defenders from their deep holes and caves, which enable them to weather the pre-attack pounding. As our advance forces secure the heights, reserve units entrench themselves in the valley to consolidate the gains. 3 midweek Chinese counterattacks are turned back by the 24th Division here in the area of the Pukan River as the Reds attempt to outflank the 25th Division salient to the west. Other groups take time out for food and rest. before resuming the attack against Red strongpoints established on the adjacent hills. In preparation for the present assault, a forward mortar position is excavated in the frozen ground halfway up the hill. The mortar is emplaced in this advanced location where it will be able to fire upon the enemy-held high ground. The sights are aligned, and the 60 millimeter begins its explosive attack. A recoilless rifle is brought into action against the stubborn resistance. A machine gun lends its firepower as the advance gets fully underway. A Chinese prisoner is brought in for questioning after the position is taken in a hard but surprisingly short fight. The PW is uncertain of what treatment to expect, and anticipating the worst, he warily eyes his captors as they execute only a thorough search.
Slowly but relentlessly, the Allies blast their way forward toward the 38th parallel in Korea, cleaning out nests of Chinese Red snipers who are fighting a rear guard action. Under cover of concentrated firepower, Operation Killer is taking a fantastic toll of the enemy. During the new strategy, General Matthew Ridgway has estimated that Red casualties have mounted to a ratio of 60-1 for the United Nations forces. Daily, the bag of prisoners mounts. These are part of the Red troops who, a few short weeks ago, were engulfing UN forces. Some are only 15. General Ridgway talks over operations with General Bradley and expresses complete confidence in the military situation. While the enemy has sustained hundreds of thousands of casualties in killed, wounded, and missing, Operation Killer has not been without loss to the Allies. On a Yokohama pier, the first American dead are on their way home for burial. Among those paying their respects is Mrs. MacArthur. All the services are represented, and even generals pay their tribute. They have given the last full measure of devotion. Melting snows and torrential rains turn the Korean battlefield into a sea of mud, through which United Nations troops slog wearily in their dogged advance on the 38th parallel. Every foot is dearly bought through the ooze. Department of Defense pictures show the heavy going that vehicles face. One contingent is caught by a sudden freshet in a dry river bed. Within minutes, the area assumes the proportions of a lake. Despite frantic efforts with sandbags, the camp is submerged, with just the tops of the tents showing. Trucks stall in swollen streams, but even General Mudd can't halt the UN progress.
On 7 March, assault troops of the U.S. 25th Infantry Division advanced to the Han River 15 miles east of Seoul. Elements of the 27th Regiment take time out for food before resuming the advance. Because of its frequent use in emergency action, this regiment has come to be known as the Fire Brigade. On the south bank of the Han, an engineer bulldozer clears an approach for a floating bridge to be erected across the river. This bridge will accommodate the medium tanks and other heavy vehicles. The 25th Division crossing begins early. The craft were brought up from the rear during the long period of waiting since the United Nations troops first reached the Han early last month. Elements of this crossing encounter little or no enemy resistance. Men of a heavy mortar squad prepare breakfast, but remain constantly on the alert. The call comes. The command to fire is given, and the crew swings into action. A tank adds its lethal punch. UN troops examine a deserted Chinese gun emplacement in the path of the advance. A causeway for a footbridge across the Han is constructed. Ducks are brought up to accommodate a greater number of troops in the crossing. Later, they do double duty by bringing back Chinese prisoners. A short 2 hours after the initial crossing, U.S. engineers are well along in their construction of a footbridge. This bridge will provide additional means of crossing for larger groups of infantrymen. Two engineers have taken unexpected plunges into the cold water of the river, and men in an assault boat go to their rescue. The accident doesn't seem to dampen the spirits of either man, and soon the footbridge is completed and in operation. By late afternoon, the entire 25th Division is across the river, and the day's objective is secured. The bridgehead is continually expanded, and by week's end, patrols are engaged in probing action 7.5 miles north of the Han. By mid-March, the renewed United Nations offensive is rolling steadily forward, nearing the 38th parallel. Members of a 7th Division reconnaissance patrol strike northward through land from which the communist forces have been withdrawing rapidly, but in good order. The tank-reinforced patrol finds little opposition from the retreating Reds. Communist resistance, which had previously been stubborn at many key points, now seems to have collapsed in most areas. However, their withdrawal route is studded with anti-tank mines and booby traps. Mine detectors sweep the narrow roads. Engineers repair a road dynamited by the retreating Reds. The collapse of communist resistance below the parallel seems to indicate that the Reds hope to prepare their spring offensive in North Korea, unmolested by UN ground attacks. The blasted area is quickly restored, and the patrol continues toward the boundary line. Enemy casualties are low as the communists, pulling back mostly at night, carry out their retreat according to careful plan. In its dash toward the parallel, the patrol passes through many gutted villages, visual testimony of the toll of war. One tank wallows in a stream, disabled by an enemy mine cleverly placed at the stream ford. Although time is precious, an attempt is made to tow the disabled tank from the water. Operating on a strict schedule, the patrol is attempting to reach the 38th parallel and return during the daylight hours. The tank bogs down in midstream and has to be abandoned. Loose equipment and removable armament are quickly stripped from the derelict tank. Near the parallel, Red rear guard positions are raked with .50 caliber fire. short of their objective, the patrol finds a demolished bridge blocking further advance and heads back to report on enemy activity in Congo.
Operation Tomahawk gets underway in Japan. Troops of the 187th Airborne, 3,300 strong, go aboard flying boxcars for what could be the last big action below the 38th parallel in Korea. Tomahawk's mission? To scalp North Korean units trapped north of Seoul. Over Munsan, 10 miles south of the parallel, the airborne veterans drift down in a shower of silk. Although most of the trapped Reds had escaped north only hours before, sizable segments were caught in the airborne squeeze. Casualties were remarkably light. Helicopters earmarked to fly out the wounded had little to carry except postcards written by the GIs before the drop, saying, "Having a wonderful time, wish you were here." But in contrast to their humor is the grim business of war in Korea. Bringing the entire Korean conflict into sharp focus, General MacArthur arrives on his 14th visit to the front. Confident that the Reds can never conquer Korea, General MacArthur voiced his willingness to discuss settlement terms. The Chinese are pouring more troops across the Manchurian border, so the war goes on.
Operation Tomahawk gains 20 miles in one day. Just before nightfall, the first tanks of the 24th Infantry Division link up with the parachutists. Tank drivers poke their heads up through their ports to have a look around. The task force reorganizes and moves out. While foot troops move up, tactical air makes a coordinated strike against the enemy's hastily constructed fortified positions in the hills. Jets deliver one of the most feared of our weapons, napalm bombs. These jellied gasoline bombs have proved highly successful in flushing the enemy from prepared positions. With air and artillery preparation completed, riflemen take up the assault and overrun the enemy's defensive lines before the communists can recover from the shock of the bombardment. This assault moves the United Nations forces one step closer to the communist-violated border of the Republic of Korea. The enemy increases his defensive fires, resisting stubbornly, sometimes fanatically, as the area of the 38th parallel becomes a battleground for the fourth time since the war started last June. A rifle platoon passes through an area burned out by napalm bombs. The only enemy found in this area was charred. An automatic rifleman spots a target of opportunity and opens fire, and a 3.5-inch bazooka team is engaged in neutralizing defensive positions. And, as always, there's just one more hill to take before the assault is completed. After the objective is overrun and the units reorganize, the men fight off the chill of the mountain climate. The serpentine route of the Imjin River creates a land pocket with a natural water barrier on three sides near the 38th parallel. Communist elements withdrew across this river after abandoning Seoul without a fight. Here on the south bank of the river, units of the 1st ROK Division prepare to cross the Imjin. South Korean troops assemble for the Imjin crossing, while their combat engineers bring up the assault boats. Brigadier General Paik Sun-yup, commanding general of the 1st ROK Division, supervises the operation which was planned by his staff officers. Areas suspected of containing hostile forces are plotted by artillerymen. The South Koreans request a fire mission from U.S. forces to support the river crossing. The mission is coordinated and artillery pieces fire as requested. Immediately following the softening up artillery fire in the area north of the Im Jin, the ROK troops load into assault boats and paddle across the river as enemy small arms fire harasses the operation. Enemy forces on the north bank, scouted earlier by a patrol, are estimated to be in company strength. This crossing is being made near the site where the main Allied supply road spanned the Im Jin last year when United Nations forces were fighting in the Pyongyang area to the north. United Nations liaison officers observe the activities as the river crossing is executed. The Im Jin is crossed successfully against ineffective resistance from North Koreans and elements of the Chinese Third Field Army. This is the beginning of a tank infantry team assault deep into enemy-held territory. Here in an undisclosed area north of Seoul, an attack order is issued for a tank infantry patrol. After the order is given, extra HE grenades are distributed. During the early dawn of the following morning, armor rendezvous with riflemen. Men of the 3rd Division mount tanks to ride during the initial phase of the patrol's advance. Mission of the tank infantry team: cross Im Jin River, probe communist defenses beyond the 38th parallel, and report back on his dispositions and equipment. Test his strength, but do not become decisively committed. Withdraw when information is secured. This is a reconnaissance in force. All roads leading into enemy territory are heavily mined. Tanks take to the Im Jin River bed, shallow here where it crosses a 38th parallel, to avoid red mines. Abandoned communist trucks are found in the river. On the far side of the Im Jin, the infantrymen dismount onto North Korean soil and prepare to move out. The patrol moves forward over the innumerable hills into which the enemy forces are dug in. Red fields of fire are not yet brought to bear on the assaulting troops. An enemy position is engaged. Extra grenades issued the night before now come in handy as the riflemen close with a defensive outpost. After the outpost defenses are overrun, the tank infantry team reorganizes and continues the advance. Incoming small arms fire and mortar rounds are beginning to slow down the speed of the patrol's forward movement. The troops are cautious not to become decisively engaged. Red resistance increases as the patrol fights into a small village located on the Kaigan Mainline Railroad, which runs between Seoul and Pyongyang. Making sure their flanks are protected, the tank infantry team punches into the village and destroys communist installations. By late afternoon, this reconnaissance in force completes its mission and returns safely to its base. After receiving an order to clear an area near the 38th parallel of communist snipers and to search roads for landmines, a detail of a reconnaissance company prepares for its mission. Weapons are loaded and a final check of equipment is made. The tank convoy gets underway. This roadway has already been cleared of mines. The men keep alert for enemy snipers. All bridges over streams and rivers have been destroyed by the withdrawing communist forces. Tanks ford streams at the shallowest points. Foot troops precede the tanks, searching for landmines. A culvert bridge blasted by retreating Reds halts the advance momentarily, but not for long. Engineer troops measure the distance to estimate bridging materials required to span the gully. In no mood to wait, a tank bypasses the wrecked bridge and presses out a detour. The tonnage of the tank smashes a new road that leads through a small village on the far side. This Jeep, in four-wheel drive and shifted in low, bogs down despite a persistent attempt to move through the giant rocks. The much heavier tank returns to smooth out the steep approaches and the rocky terrain. Now the Jeep moves over the detour and out the other side over the tank-made path. Teamwork pays off. Remember the sign on the American roads that said, "Beware soft shoulder"? Well, here's what it can mean in Korea. Another tank moves up to the disabled one, but can be of no assistance. Crew members sweat it out while their tank balances precariously. Chinese surrender leaflets are found in the vicinity of the disabled tank, and tankers read the propaganda through curious but distrusting eyes. The usual reaction to these propaganda leaflets is the traditional but appropriate nuts. After radioing for a tank retriever, the recon detail moves on to accomplish its mission.
The storm which has been brewing between Washington and General MacArthur finally breaks with the news that the Supreme Commander has been dismissed by President Truman. Members of the press leave the conference in Washington to release the world-shaking story which will affect international policy in every capital. The center of the controversy, General Douglas MacArthur, is shown at his Tokyo headquarters. Here he administered the occupation of defeated Japan and directed the defense of Korea. At the request of the United Nations, President Truman appointed him to lead the Allied powers in the fight against communism in the Far East. In Japan and at the front, he served the nation and the United Nations with unfailing vigor. His record in previous campaigns brought him an enviable reputation as a fearless warrior. His many visits to the Korean front lines kept him constantly informed of the situation and the movements of the communist armies arrayed against his command. President Truman flew to meet with MacArthur last year, and on that occasion they discussed overall policy and apparently agreed on future conduct of the fight against Red aggression. But in the final analysis, the disagreements between immediate strategy and international diplomacy resulted in General MacArthur's dismissal. General Ridgway now takes over from MacArthur as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief, Far East, and Commanding General, United States Army, Far East. In Washington, congressmen voiced their individual opinions of the president's order. Republicans and Democrats alike are forthright in their public comment. Representative Morgan, Democrat of Pennsylvania.
The first qualification of a soldier is to be able to carry out commands. General MacArthur seems to be above that qualification. He has defied both the chiefs of staff and a trust placed in him by the United Nations. I commend the action of the president.
Senator Ferguson, Republican from Michigan.
I believe that the president's action today in the removal of General MacArthur was a tragic mistake. I'm of the opinion it was caused by the President's failure to recognize the overall communist aggression, that it is global and international. It is, in my opinion, an appeasement of the British philosophy that was brought here in December by Mr. Attlee. I also feel that it is against the best interests of America.
At the White House, the administration, represented by the President, is seriously concerned. Mr. Truman speaks to the nation, outlining the reasons for his action regarding world policy.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual. The change in commands in the Far East means no change whatever in the policy of the United States. We will carry on the fight in Korea with vigor and determination in an effort to bring the war to a speedy and successful conclusion. The free nations have united their strength in an effort to prevent a third world war. That war can come if the communist rulers want it to come. But this nation and its allies will not be responsible for its coming. We do not want to widen the conflict. We will use every effort to prevent that disaster. And in so doing, we know that we are following the great principles of peace, freedom, and justice.
General of the Army Douglas MacArthur comes to his headquarters in Tokyo for the last time. Next up, Hawaii, and then the United States, the homeland he has not seen for 14 years. There are many important matters on the agenda that must be resolved before the general takes off. Prior to his departure, his successor, General Matthew B. Ridgway, arrives for a conference. General Ridgway takes over the several commands in the Far East for the United Nations and the United States. Before he leaves his home at the American Embassy in Tokyo, General MacArthur is honored by a visit from Emperor Hirohito. The Emperor drove from the Imperial Palace to the residence of the former Supreme Commander, a courtesy that is without precedent in the history of Nippon's rulers. He is escorted to Haneda Airport for his departure to the United States, and his command is on hand to wish him happy landings. As he takes leave of the nation to which he taught the principles of democracy, he is accorded a 19-gun salute. Here is another record to mark up on the scrolls of history. Only General Pershing ever received this mark of respect prior to General MacArthur's leave-taking from Japan. While the big guns boom farewell, the five-star general reviews his troops for the last time. After the formal ceremonies, Japanese and other dignitaries gathered to pay their respects to their one-time foe and sincere friend. Mrs. MacArthur and their 13-year-old son, who has never seen his native land, share in the goodbyes. The general's plane, the Bataan, heads home, where a warm welcome awaits. After 14 long years, General MacArthur comes home. Preceded by Mrs. MacArthur and followed by 13-year-old son Arthur, the hero of the Pacific debarks at San Francisco to deafening cheers. Governor Warren of California has a warm welcome for the man whose dismissal has stirred the nation. Mrs. MacArthur and her son, who charmed the crowd, share the limelight in a throng which all but overwhelms the general in its enthusiasm. This was but a prelude to a parade the following day, during which 500,000 San Franciscans cheered themselves hoarse all along the line of march. All political aspirations were firmly rejected by the Pacific commander. A little Korean miss sees General MacArthur drive off to receive an ovation from the city whose earthquake and fire he helped fight 45 years before. A joint meeting of the two houses of Congress is assembled to hear General MacArthur state his case on the Far East policy. He receives a tumultuous welcome as he is greeted by Vice President Barkley and Speaker of the House Rayburn. Members applaud not the issues nor the great debate. They applaud a great soldier and patriot who opens his address with characteristic candor.
I address you with neither rancor nor bitterness. In the fading twilight of life, with but one purpose in mind, to serve my country.
The applause of members subsides as the general points out the vital necessity of retaining Formosa in the chain of Pacific defenses that will keep war from United States shores.
For that reason, I have strongly recommended in the past, as a matter of military urgency, that under no circumstances must Formosa fall under communist control.
4 major points are the keystone of his defense policy. Permission to bomb Manchurian bases, blockade of the China coast, logistical support of Chiang Kai-shek's troops in an attack on the China mainland, and the retention of Formosa. His military appraisal of the situation.
That from a military standpoint, the above views have been fully shared in past by practically every military leader concerned with the Korean campaign, including our own Joint Chiefs of Staff.
An old soldier delivers his touching valedictory.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
It's MacArthur Day in New York. The big town makes it a 5-star welcome for the 5-star hero of the Pacific. The world's greatest city says, welcome home, with the greatest demonstration in its history. Mrs. MacArthur and young Arthur share with him the cheers of the multitude. A carelessly tossed match ignites a pile of ticker tape just after the general's car passes. The veritable blizzard of paper is a full measure of New York's enthusiasm. East side, west side, all around the big town they form solid walls of humanity for 37 miles along the homecoming route. And the weather, perfect. Just about everybody is out today. An estimated 7.5 million men, women, and children. City Hall Square is jammed. From Mayor Impellitteri, a scroll and a medal, tokens of New York's affection and esteem. Washington Square is an arch of triumph for a returning soldier. It tops all other demonstrations in a demonstrative city's long history. And General Douglas MacArthur said to New York, "You have made me feel that I am indeed home." The change of leadership in Korea brought on by the sudden dismissal of General MacArthur makes little difference to the GI and his UN allies at the front. For them, the war goes on, uninterrupted by high echelon changes of command. It's a walking war, too, against a foe well entrenched in mountain positions. The artillery is called on to blast a path for the ground forces. By keeping the offensive, they hope to keep the Reds off balance, stall the long-awaited spring offensive. Plenty of firepower is an effective antidote to communist counter-thrusts. It's fast work. The Long Toms really clobbered that hill. South of the front lines, trucks roll into Seoul on a mission of mercy. Food for the city's starving thousands who have seen the tide of war ebb and flow. Good news spreads quickly, rice for everyone, and a square deal is assured. Busan, key port in the old beachhead, is the scene of a dramatic ceremony. A permanent United Nations cemetery is dedicated as a resting place for Dutch and other UN fighters for freedom. French war dead are among those honored here at Busan, as are the Canadians. They fought as free men for a free world.